In this session, we're going to be looking at the purpose and functions of a web browser. You should also be able to describe how web pages are located, retrieved, and displayed on a device when a user enters a URL. Now, we do all of this every day. You go to a website, you just open up your browser, which could be Safari or Chrome, and you just type in youtube.com and it takes you there. But we never actually think deeply about how all of this works. But before we begin, let's start with a knowledge check. See if you remember things from the last lesson. Pause the video and have a go at these statements. Are these features part of the internet or the World Wide Web? Okay, it is possible to send and receive emails. Well, that's quite clearly the internet. Makes use of HTTP protocols. That's the World Wide Web. Uses URLs to specify the locations of websites and web pages. World Wide Web again. Resources can be accessed by using web browsers. World Wide Web again. Makes use of TCP and IP. That's quite clearly the internet, because those are fundamental communications protocols that form the basis of the internet. Okay, that's enough about what we covered last session. Let's focus on what the purpose is of today's video. Let's start with the role of DNS. DNS is the domain name server. Now, what is it? What's its purpose? Well, it only has a singular purpose. Whenever you type in a website address, it converts it into the relevant IP address, the Internet Protocol address, because that's the location where the server is amongst billions of computers around the planet. Now think about this in a logical way. There are billions, possibly trillions of websites, and new websites are being created every second. If your computer or your browser in your computer had to remember all of the IP addresses, your SSD or your hard disk drive would be full. There would be no space for anything else. So these domain name servers are created, and their purpose is simply to translate the browser's word-based URL to an IP address. And similarly, you can't just have one DNS, because that server could be overloaded or it wouldn't have enough space. So you have multiple DNSs and backup servers all over the internet. And all of them work in tandem together to ensure that your browser, whenever the user types in a URL, can find the relevant IP address. So how does the process work? Well, we start with HTML, hypertext markup language, which is used to display content on web browsers. All websites are written in HTML, and they have to be hosted on a web server that has its own IP address. To retrieve pages from a website, your browser needs to know this IP address. This is where DNS comes in. You might be wondering what an IP address is. Well, that's a unique address given to a device when it connects to a network. So normally your ISP or the web server's ISP gives an IP address. And these can be static and dynamic, and we'll look into all of that later. Your computer doesn't understand text, so the URL that you type in needs to be changed to a relevant numerical IP address. So remember that. And this is where the domain name server comes in. So put simply, the DNS is a system for finding IP addresses for a domain name which is given in a URL. URLs and domain name servers eliminate the need for a user to memorize long numerical IP addresses. It's easier to remember something like youtube.com rather than 208.65.153.238. And since there are billions of websites out there, multiple DNS devices are used to hold these addresses, and they communicate with each other as well if they can't find the IP address of a particular URL. The diagram on screen gives an indication of the entire process. The user is there with the browser, requests a website's IP address, the DNS will then send it to it. Now, the process involves converting a URL into an IP address that the computer can understand. And the DNS process normally involves more than one server. Each DNS contains a database of URLs with the matching IP address. So it's basically a list. And if its list doesn't contain the IP address of perhaps the URL that you want, then it connects to another DNS. And that might connect to another DNS. And this process repeats until they find the DNS with the matching IP address, and then that IP address is sent to the previous DNS, and then it works its way backwards, and each DNS will update its list until it reaches your device. So once you have the IP address, you can connect to that web server. In an exam, you will need to list down the number of steps. The retrieval and location of web pages is a very common question. Pause the video so you can understand the steps. They're pretty straightforward. and if you go through them once, you'll understand how the process works. The user opens their browser and types in the URL. The browser asks DNS1 perhaps for the IP address. If the DNS1 can't find the URL and its matching IP address in its database or its cache, it sends out a request to a second DNS. The DNS2 finds the URL and can map it to perhaps an IP address, and this IP address is sent back to DNS1, which now puts this IP address in its cache or its database. This IP address is then sent back to the user's computer. The computer now sets up a communication with the website server, and the required pages are downloaded. HTML files are sent from the website server to the computer. The browser interprets the HTML, which is used to structure content, and then displays the information for the user, and you have your nice web page on screen. And all of that happens in a fraction of a second most of the time. Let's revisit the role of the browser though. Now, in the previous lesson, we looked at what browsers did. Browsers translate the HTML from websites and show the result of the translation. Most browsers have the following features: have a home page, can store bookmarks, can keep a history, allow navigation, make use of cookies, and so on. Pause the video if you have forgotten about it, so you can revisit this section. If you're okay with this, continue on. In this particular process, browsers send URL to DNS. They receive the IP address from the DNS. They connect to the web server using HTTP. They request HTML and CSS, which stands for cascading style sheets. This is a presentation of the website, and any active script such as JavaScript from the server. So all of this information is sent to. Once the data is received, browsers render the HTML and CSS and run any active scripts, for example, JavaScript code, to display the web page. Your buttons, which you click on, are basically JavaScript. Sometimes they also use HTTPS. This protocol uses encryption for security. Now, this involves the use of digital certificates. Digital certificates are kind of like a passport, which are issued by a trusted certificate authority. So what happens is that a web server might say, well, I'm a genuine organization. I would like other people to trust us. So we're going to apply for this digital certificate. They pay some money, they give some documents, and the certificate authority will then issue a digital certificate. This certificate is then sent back to the web browser. The web browser will check if it is genuine or authentic. If it is, then it will allow transmission to begin. If it's not, then it will simply report to the user that the web server is not secure. Now, you often see this happen sometimes when you go to websites which might not be quite genuine. Your browser will simply say that this website cannot be trusted. We'll delve a bit more deeper into all of this later. But for now, let's check your understanding of what we covered so far. You should be able to answer what is meant by DNS, its full form. You should be able to explain what an IP address is. You should be able to describe how a URL can be converted to an IP address. You should be able to answer what is the process of locating and retrieving web pages. This is a big one, so a number of steps are involved here. You should be able to list 3 common features of a web browser. And you should be able to describe the role of a browser in transmitting data securely through the use of things like digital certificates and certificate authorities. If you struggle with any of these questions, do rewind the video back and have a look through that. The answers are in there. But if you're still struggling, please make sure you post it in the comments and I'll get back to you. Hopefully you understood the role of the DNS and how a browser allows for secure exchange of information online. That's all for now. I'll see you in the next one.